When was the last time you sat in a room and did absolutely nothing? No phone, no background music, no mental list of what you'll tackle when you get up. Just present, in a chair, or on a porch, or at a window. Existing. Most people, when they actually try it, last about 90 seconds before something tightens. A low-grade alarm. The sense that they are wasting something. Time, momentum, the day. And then the phone comes out, or the errand gets remembered, and the moment is over. Here is what nobody has told you about that tightening. It is not a sign of your virtue. It is not your conscience signaling that you have things to do and a life to live. It is something older and something that was done to you. A verdict was handed to you about what human time is for, and you have been carrying it so long it feels like your own conviction. Tonight I want to give you the name for what was taken from you. And I want to show you exactly how the taking happened. Because once you can see the mechanism, the guilt loses its authority. Not entirely, but enough. Start with the phrase itself, doing nothing. Notice that it is already a verdict. It concedes the prosecution's entire case in the name of the activity. The moment you call it doing nothing, you have already agreed that nothing is happening, that no value is being produced, no progress made, no contribution rendered. But that verdict comes from somewhere. It is not a neutral description. It is the output of a particular way of measuring human life, one that gained nearly total cultural dominance in the last 2 centuries, so gradually that we stopped noticing it was a way of measuring it all. It began to feel like simple truth. Time has value only when it produces something. A person has worth only when they are contributing something. Rest is justified only as recovery for more work. And stillness, genuine, purposeless, receptive stillness, is waste. That is the framework. And what I want to show you is that it is not the only framework that has ever existed. It is not even, by the measure of the serious traditions, the best one. It is, in fact, a relatively recent installation, and one that every tradition worth taking seriously, from Aristotle to the medieval theologians to the 20th century philosophers who first saw what was happening, recognized as a category error. A profound and costly mistake about what human beings are for. Go back far enough and you find something that should stop you cold. The ancient Greeks had a word for leisure, scholē, and they meant by it something precise. Not idleness, not recreation, not the absence of work. They meant the freedom to direct your attention without an ulterior purpose. The space in which a human being could think, reflect, contemplate, and become more fully themselves. And here is the thing that should stay with you. That Greek word scholē is the direct ancestor of the English word school. The word we use for the place where human beings are formed intellectually, where knowledge is transmitted and the mind is shaped, that word comes from the Greek word for leisure. Because for Aristotle and the tradition he was working within, genuine learning was not possible without it. The person who has no space for contemplation has no ground in which understanding can take root. A mind in permanent motion, permanently oriented toward tasks and outputs, and the next thing to be accomplished, that mind can accumulate information. What it cannot do, Aristotle argued, is grow wise. In the Nicomachean Ethics and again in the Politics, Aristotle makes a claim that sounds almost offensive to modern ears. We work in order to have leisure, not the other way around. Leisure is not the reward at the end of a productive life. It is the purpose toward which the productive life is properly oriented. The activity of contemplation, the careful, unhurried engagement with the most important questions, is the highest human activity, not because it feels good, because it is the activity most fully expressive of what human beings distinctively are. That is not a fringe position in the Western tradition. It is close to the consensus of the serious minds across 2.5 millennia. And somewhere in the last 2 centuries, we quietly abandoned it and installed guilt in its place. Michael Oakeshott saw this happening, not on a screen. He was writing in the mid-20th century, before the digital acceleration, but in the cultural logic that was already fully operational. In an essay called Work and Play, Oakeshott draws a distinction that is simple to state and genuinely difficult to hold. There are 2 kinds of human activity. The first kind is performed for the sake of something else, for a product, an outcome, a goal beyond the activity itself. Call this work in the broadest sense, not just paid labor, but any activity whose meaning lies in what it produces. The second kind is performed for its own sake, not because of what it yields, but because of what it is. The activity and its value are not separable. You cannot achieve the value by taking a shortcut to the output, because the output is not the point. The doing is the point. Oakeshott called this second kind play, and he meant by it something far more serious than recreation. He meant the category of human activity in which we are most fully present, most fully ourselves, because we are not treating the moment as a means to a later moment. We are not managing the present for the sake of the future. We are, as he put it, delighting in what is present. Now, here is the problem. The cultural inheritance that Oakeshott spent his career examining, the tradition he called rationalism, is built almost entirely on the first category. The rationalist is the person who believes that every human problem can be solved if you find the right technique and apply it correctly. Every challenge has a formula. Every domain can be mastered if you acquire the right set of explicit principles. And implicit in this entire worldview is the assumption that value is located in outputs, in what you can show for your time, in what you can hand over. What the rationalist cannot see, by the very structure of the rationalist worldview, is any activity whose value is intrinsic. Any activity that does not produce a transferable result looks, from inside rationalism, like waste. And leisure, true leisure, contemplative stillness, produces nothing transferable, nothing you can put in a report or measure in a metric or describe to someone who asks what you did today. So under the rationalist inheritance, it disappears, not by decree, by invisible reclassification. It simply becomes, gradually, indistinguishable from doing nothing. That reclassification had help. It did not happen through philosophy alone. There is a reading of Western history, and I want to present it honestly as a reading, an interpretation, not a simple fact, in which the Protestant Reformation and the Industrial Revolution arrived within 2 centuries of each other, and together rewired the Western understanding of time. The Reformation, in some of its streams, elevated diligence in one's calling to a near spiritual category. The person who works faithfully is not just productive, they are honoring God. The Industrial Revolution then provided the material infrastructure, a world organized around production schedules, output quotas, the clock as moral authority. Max Weber saw this connection over a century ago. What he called the Protestant ethic, the anxiety-driven accumulation of work as a sign of divine favor, did not just produce capitalism. It produced a particular conscience, a conscience that experiences rest as vulnerability and stillness as a kind of failure. I am not saying the reformers were wrong about vocation. I am saying that when the genuine theological insight about work as calling gets separated from the theological tradition that also honored the Sabbath, the ora et labora, the contemplative life, what you get is conscience without its counterweight, diligence without its ground, and eventually, a culture in which the person who sits quietly and does nothing feels a guilt they cannot quite name or justify but cannot shake. That is where most of the people in this channel's audience are living, not because of a personal failure, because of a cultural program that ran so long and so quietly that it began to feel like character. C.S. Lewis saw it coming from a different angle. In the Screwtape letters, the fictional correspondence of a senior demon advising his nephew on how to corrupt a human soul, Screwtape gives advice that is easy to miss on a first reading because it sounds so mild. He tells Wormwood not to worry about filling the patient's mind with obviously sinful thoughts. The more reliable strategy is simpler. Keep him busy. Fill his attention with the stream of immediate sense experiences. Keep noise going. Keep something always pending. Because the dangerous moment, the moment when the enemy's influence is most likely, is the moment of genuine quiet. Lewis was not talking about productivity culture specifically. He was talking about prayer, about the interior life, about the space in which a human being can hear anything beyond their own agenda, but the application extends with uncomfortable precision. What Screwtape understands is that noise and busyness are not merely distracting. They are protective. They protect the person from what they would find in the silence. Josef Pieper, the German Catholic philosopher, put the same insight in the language of medieval theology. He reached back to a concept the scholastics called acedia, usually translated into English as sloth, and usually understood as laziness. But Pieper argued that this translation misses the actual sin entirely. Acedia, in the original sense, is not the sin of the person who does too little, it is the sin of the person who cannot be still, who feels every hour, not because they love their work, but because they are afraid of what would surface if the work stopped. The medieval theologians understood acedia as a flight from the self, a restlessness so constitutive that it mistakes its own motion for virtue. The ascetic person is not lazy. They are exhausted and perpetually busy, and they have no idea why they cannot rest. Pieper was writing in 1948, and his argument is this: the modern West has created conditions in which acedia is not just tolerated, it is rewarded. It looks like productivity. It looks like conscientiousness. It looks like the life well lived. And because of that, the person suffering from it has almost no way to recognize it from the inside. The guilt they feel when they sit still feels like conscience. It is not conscience, it is the symptom. This is the inversion I want you to hold for a moment, because it changes the shape of everything that came before. The guilt you feel when you sit still and do nothing, that tightening, that alarm, has been presenting itself to you as a moral signal, as your better self calling you back to what matters. But look at what it is actually doing. It is calling you back to motion, to output, to the production of something that can be measured. And in doing so, it is pulling you away from the one activity that every serious tradition, Greek philosophy, Christian theology, Oakeshott's conservative humanism, identified as the ground of genuine wisdom, genuine faith, and genuine self-knowledge. The person who fills every hour in order to feel virtuous may be fleeing without knowing it. The very activity that makes virtue possible. The silence in which you find out who you actually are. The quiet in which the questions you have been too busy to ask finally become audible. The contemplative space in which faith becomes more than habit and conviction becomes more than repetition. Pieper called leisure the basis of culture. He did not mean a vacation. He meant the inner disposition, the willingness to receive experience without immediately converting it into output that makes genuine human life possible. Without it, he argued, what you have is not a productive culture, you have a servile one. A culture of people who have forgotten that they were not made only to work. If you have found yourself wanting more of this kind of thinking, not just the insight, but the vocabulary that lets you carry it, I want to point you towards something that might be exactly what you need. In the link in the description, there is a guide called The Navigator's Toolkit, 12 Oakeshott Concepts for Modern Life. It takes the most practically useful ideas from Oakeshott's philosophy, including the work and play distinction, the nature of tacit knowledge, what it means to hold a disposition rather than a technique, and gives you each one with a definition, a contemporary example, a way to apply it, and Oakeshott's own words. It is designed to be the thing you reach for when you feel the idea but cannot yet find the language. If this video gave you one key, the toolkit gives you 12. So what does this look like in practice? Not as a technique, because the moment you give yourself a technique for leisure, you have converted it back into work, and the rationalist wins again. As a disposition, as a way of orienting yourself to time that is different from the way you have been taught. Oakeshott, in an essay on what he called the poetic mode of experience, described something that most people have felt and almost nobody has named. There is a way of engaging with the world, with a view from a window, a piece of music, a passage of text, a walk without a destination, in which you are not extracting anything, not learning, not improving, not gathering material, simply receiving. Present to the experience without converting it into a product. That is not emptiness. It is a particular kind of fullness. And it requires, as its only precondition, that you stop treating the moment as a means to a later moment. It might be a chair and a window in 20 minutes. It might be a walk where you leave the phone at home and have no route in mind. It might be sitting in a church before the service starts, in the actual silence, without filling it. The form is almost beside the point. What matters is the orientation, not toward output, not toward improvement, not toward the next thing, but toward what is present. What is here? What is, if you are willing to be still long enough to notice it, already enough? Augustine wrote it in the 4th century, and nobody has improved on it since. Our heart is restless until it rests in thee. He was talking about God, but the restlessness he named is the same restlessness Pieper named as acedia, the same restlessness Oakeshott diagnosed in The Rationalist, who can only see value in output, the same restlessness that sends your hand to your phone 90 seconds into a quiet moment. The heart is restless. That is not a pathology, that is the human condition. But there is a difference, and it is the difference this whole video has been building toward, between a restlessness that seeks, that sits still long enough to encounter something, and a restlessness that flees, that fills every hour precisely because it is afraid of what stillness might reveal. The guilt you feel when you sit still and do nothing is not your virtue speaking. It is the flight instinct of a culture that forgot, or was made to forget, that the greatest minds it ever produced thought contemplation was not an absence of activity. They thought it was the point of everything else. There is a question I want to leave with you, not as an assignment, but as something worth carrying, because I think the answer is different for everyone. And I think it takes some silence to find it. What would you discover if you sat still long enough to discover it? If there is a moment that comes to mind, a time when you tried to be still and found something unexpected, or a time you couldn't manage it and you still remember why, I'd be glad to hear about it.